Now, on the flip side, we might have some contractionary policies that are needed to be implemented whenever we're experiencing that rapid expansion, right? Whenever we're experiencing rapid expansion and we need to kind of just pump the brakes a little bit, bring our economy back to its normal sustainable rate, what we see is that there are policies, again, that can be taken by the government or by the Federal Reserve in order to do that. So in order to slow the growth of our GDP, what we need to see is we need that to decrease, which is also seen as a decrease in our aggregate demand curve. So what are the fiscal policy actions, those actions specifically taken by the government, that they could do in order to make this happen? Well, we could see that they might decrease government spending. And so obviously when they decrease government spending, it causes government spending to decrease. So that G on the right-hand side of our equation is going to go down. But another thing that they could do is they could increase taxes. Now, by increasing taxes, what we see is that now you and I have more money that we're paying to the government. And since we have more money we're paying to the government, that's less money that you and I have to go out and spend, which means consumer spending is going to decrease. Now, that means the C on the right-hand side of that equation is going to go down. And if you notice, both of those things are having the same effect. They cause the left-hand side, or our real GDP, to decrease as well. And so again, what we see is by implementing either a decrease in government spending or increasing taxes, the government can influence our real GDP and cause it to slow. Now, what are the actions that can be taken by the Federal Reserve? Again, when experiencing that rapid expansion, we just want to pump the brakes. We need to kind of step off the gas, slow things down a bit, bring us back to that sustainable rate. So we need to do those things that cause a decrease in our aggregate demand, which will, again, bring our real GDP back to its hopefully long-run equilibrium. So let's think about this. One thing that they could do is they could increase the reserve ratio. So what that means is banks are now required to hang on to a larger percentage of any deposit, which means there's less money that they can then use to make loans. And if they're making fewer loans, that's less money that can be created through making loans. We also see that they could increase the discount rate. They could increase that interest rate that banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve. And if they do that, that means that banks won't be borrowing money from the Federal Reserve as often. And if they're not doing that as often, what that means is they're not going to be making as many loans. And again, that means they're not going to be creating as much money. And the last thing you could do is sell government securities. So what the Federal Reserve essentially is doing in this case is they're pulling money out of the money supply. What they'll do is they'll go to banks or whoever might be holding onto these government IOUs, this government debt, and they'll say, hey, here, we'll give you these IOUs, we'll sell them to you, you give us cash money in return. And by the Federal Reserve taking on that cash money, what they're actually doing is they're pulling it out of the money supply. And so again, all three of these things are doing the same thing. They're causing our money supply to decrease. Now, as our money supply decreases, what we see is there's less money out there in general. And what that does is it causes the price of money, the price to borrow money, to go up. Interest rates will increase. Now, as interest rates increase, it's more expensive for people like you and me or for businesses to borrow money. So maybe people will hold off on buying a new house, or they'll hold off on buying a new car, or companies will hold off on building a new factory. And what that means is investment and consumer spending are both going to decrease. We see a decrease in that C and a decrease in the I. And again, since we see decreases happening to the right-hand side of our equation, we're going to see the same thing happen to our left side of equation because our real GDP is going to decrease. So again, what does this look like on the model? Well, we had said that this is an instance where we're kind of beyond our potential. We're to the right there of our long-run aggregate supply. And whether we implement those fiscal policy actions like increasing taxes or decreasing government spending, or maybe we implement monetary policy actions to the Federal Reserve like increasing the reserve ratio, increasing the discount rate, or selling government securities, what we see is that these policies are all complementary. They all are trying to do the same thing. They're all moving the aggregate demand curve in the same direction. Specifically, they're all causing a decrease in our aggregate demand, right? All of those things will cause less demand in our economy as a whole, whether it's through less consumer spending, less investment spending, or less government spending. And since there's less demand as a whole, that aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. But if you notice, it causes our real GDP to move along our x-axis there from YE, our previous equilibrium, to YP. We're back at our potential, that long run, that point, that equilibrium, which is our goal.